The alarm went off at 5:15. Elijah Cross didn't fight it. He never did. He just opened his eyes in the dark and lay still for a moment, listening to the house settle around him the way old houses do. In the hours before dawn, the pipe in the wall, the floor in the hallway that creaked in the same spot it had always creaked. The particular silence of a neighborhood that hadn't woken up yet. He got up, dressed in the dark. Dark work pants, gray thermal shirt, the kind of clothes a man puts on when the day ahead requires steadiness more than appearance. He went downstairs without turning on the lights because he knew every step of this house the way you know something you've lived inside for 11 years. The third step from the bottom, the spot near the kitchen doorway where the floor dips slightly to the left. He made coffee. While it brewed, he unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. Philadelphia in October had a particular quality to its mornings. The cold came in low and flat off the river, moving through the streets without apology, and the light, when it finally came, arrived sideways rather than overhead, making everything look more permanent than it probably was. Elijah stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the street. Delwood Avenue ran quiet at this hour, chain-link fences, telephone wires that sagged a little lower every winter. The corner grocery at the end of the block where Bernard Cole had been turning the lights on at 6:30 every morning for 23 years without exception. Houses that had been repaired so many times they wore their history on their exteriors. Patches of newer brick beside older brick aluminum siding, added over wood that had started to rot roof lines that didn't quite match anymore because they had been fixed by whoever was available rather than whoever was ideal. Number 22 was the exception. Not because it was larger or newer or in any way distinguished from its neighbors in terms of structure. It was the same narrow two-story row house that all of them were. But the porch was swept, the steps were clean. The gutters had been cleared 3 weeks ago before the leaves came down in force, because Elijah had learned a long time ago that the things you let slide in October became the things that cost you money in January. He picked up the broom that leaned against the porch railing and began to sweep. There wasn't much to sweep. There never was at 5:30 in the morning. But he swept anyway, moving methodically from the far end of the porch toward the steps, because this was how the day started, and the day needed to start with something that could be completed, something that had a beginning and an end, and left the thing cleaner than it had been before. He was on his second pass when he noticed the car. It was at the far end of the block, parked under the streetlight that flickered at the corner of Delwood and Marsh. A sedan, dark-colored, possibly black. Too new for this street. Too clean. The kind of car that had never had a dent worried over in a driveway, never been taken to a cousin's shop for a repair that was mostly prayer and mismatched paint. Elijah looked at it for a moment. Then he continued sweeping. Inside, he poured his coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard. A small square of concrete and dirt, a rusted metal chair he kept meaning to replace a garden that had existed when he and Renata first moved in, and that he had let go to grass in the years since. Because some things you maintain and some things you don't, and the garden had fallen into the second category without him ever making a conscious decision about it. He drank his coffee and thought about the day ahead. A tile installation job in Chestnut Hill, a house owned by a man who had hired him through a referral rather than a background check, which was the only way Elijah got work in his actual field of expertise anymore. The job was straightforward. He was good at it. He would do it well and get paid and come home. He heard the alarm from upstairs, then the snooze, then the alarm again. He called up the staircase without raising his voice much. Just enough. Second one's the last one, Cora. A muffled sound from above that might have been acknowledgement. Elijah turned back to the coffee. Cora Cross was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's way of moving through the world. Deliberate, observant, not easily startled. She came downstairs at 7 in the gray wool sweater she had decided was her sweater for the season, meaning she wore it most days until sometime in November, when she would decide it was time for the green one. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at her cereal bowl, and then at her father, with the particular evaluating look she brought to most things. "It's cold out," she said. "It's October," Elijah said. "That's what October does." She considered this as though it was new information, then accepted it and began eating. This was how most of their mornings went. Not quiet exactly, but not noisy either. A kind of efficient companionship that had developed over years of just the two of them in this kitchen, learning how much space to give each other before the day started. Along the hallway wall, visible from where Elijah stood at the counter, were Cora's drawings. Not a random scattering, a deliberate arrangement, each one taped in careful rows at consistent heights. Crayon houses with yellow windows. Stick figures with enormous hands. A purple horse she had drawn when she was 5, and that she still defended with complete conviction when anyone suggested the proportions were unusual. He had never taken them down. He had looked at them every morning for years, and they had been in ways he had never put into precise language, exactly the kind of thing a man holds on to when the larger dignities have been stripped away from him. He was rinsing his coffee cup when Cora said without looking up from her cereal, "There's a car at the end of the street. It was there when I looked out the window." Elijah set the cup on the rack. "I know." She looked up at him, then reading his face the way she'd been doing since she was old enough to understand that his face told her things his words sometimes didn't. She didn't ask anything else. She went back to her cereal. He walked her to the corner at 7:55. She adjusted the strap of her backpack with the efficient two-handed motion she had developed over the past year. The bus was already at the far end of the block, working its way toward them. "Learning about bridges today," she said. Not to him particularly, just announcing the day's content. "What kind of bridges?" Elijah asked. "Suspension, and arch." She paused. "And cantilever." He looked at her. "Mrs. Delacroix said we'd go in order of how they work," Cora continued. "Simplest to most complicated." The bus stopped. The door opened. Cora climbed the steps without looking back the way she always did, and found a seat on the left side the way she always did, and looked out the window at him with the expression she always had, not quite a wave, not quite nothing. Something in between that he had come to recognize as her version of goodbye. He watched the bus go. Then he stood on the corner for a moment longer, looking down Delwood Avenue toward where the sedan had been parked. It was still there. He was back on the porch at 3:40 in the afternoon when the sedan moved. It came down Delwood slowly the way a car moves when it's looking for a specific address and being careful not to overshoot it. Elijah was sitting in the metal chair he kept on the porch, the one that was only slightly less rusted than the one in the backyard, reading a structural engineering manual he had checked out from the library because his certifications were still technically suspended, but he saw no reason to stop understanding his own field. He set the book face down on his knee when the sedan pulled to the curb directly in front of number 22. It was a Mercedes, 3 years old, maybe 4. Black, Pennsylvania plates. He noted these things automatically, the way a man notes the details of a situation before he understands what kind of situation it is. The driver's door opened. The woman who stepped out was around 30, possibly a few years older. White, dark slacks, a navy blazer, hair pulled back in a way that was professional without being severe. She wasn't flashy. She didn't look like someone who needed to prove anything with what she wore. She looked like someone who had thought carefully about how to appear less threatening than she might actually be. She stood beside the car for a moment looking at the house. Not casing it, not nervous exactly. More like someone who had been rehearsing a particular moment for a long time and had arrived at the moment and was discovering it was different from every version they had practiced. She started up the front path. Curtains moved in the window at number 20 across the street. Bernard Cole Elijah knew would be on his way back from the corner groceries back inventory right about now, and if he glanced down the street, which Bernard always did, he would see this. The information would be filed. That was how Delwood Avenue worked. It had a long memory and a short tolerance for things that didn't add up. The woman stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She looked up at him. "My name is Sylvia Harmon," she said. Her voice was steady. Whatever it cost her to keep it steady wasn't visible in the surface of it. "My father passed away 9 weeks ago. I came to find you because I found something in his safe that belongs to you, or that you need to know exists." Elijah did not move. He did not speak. He looked at her with the face of a man who had learned through necessity and repetition not to react to things until he understood what they actually were. He knew that name. He had spent 6 years learning how to carry it without letting it weigh him differently at particular moments, when he heard construction news on the radio, when he drove past a job site on a major contract, when someone mentioned the Caldwell Crossing Bridge in conversation without knowing they were mentioning it, to the one person in the city who had a specific and irrevocable relationship with that structure. Harmon Infrastructure Group, the company that had built Caldwell Crossing, the company that had built by his count 4 other major projects in the Delaware Valley since then, all of them funded, all of them profitable, all of them carrying the weight of what he knew and what he couldn't prove, and what it had cost him to know it. He looked at Sylvia Harmon standing at the bottom of his porch steps and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, something more like the cold clarity that comes when a thing you've been living alongside finally steps into the light where you can see its actual shape. He set the book on the porch railing. He stood. "I have 10 minutes," he said. What Elijah Cross had done 6 years ago was simple. It was the simplest thing he had ever done professionally, and it had cost him everything. He had been the senior safety supervisor on the Caldwell Crossing Bridge project. 11 months into a 14-month contract at a point when the eastern span was 60% complete and the project was running 11 days ahead of schedule, which was a source of considerable satisfaction to everyone involved, except Elijah, who had long since learned that projects running ahead of schedule were projects where corners were being considered. On a Thursday morning in early October, he had arrived at the site before the crew the way he always did. The eastern span's secondary support structure. A routine walkthrough before the day's work began. The cracks were in the lower third of 3 adjacent columns. Diagonal stress lines subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough time reading concrete to understand what it was communicating. He had crouched down and looked at those columns for a long time. Not panicking, not yet thinking about timelines or project directors or what was going to happen when he reported what he was seeing. Just looking. Just reading the material the way he had been trained to read it, the way he had been reading it for 17 years at that point. The columns were telling him something very clear. He went back to the site trailer and wrote the report that same morning. 4 pages photographs, attached precise language, no hedging, no softening. He described what he had seen where he had seen it, what it indicated, and what action he was recommending. Immediate construction halt on the eastern span. Independent structural review before any further work on those columns. He submitted it through the project management system before noon. He also sent a physical copy to the Regional Safety Commission by certified mail tracking number signature required on delivery. And he kept a copy at home in a manila folder in the third drawer of the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, because he had learned early in his career that documentation had a way of disappearing when it became inconvenient, and he was not going to let that happen to him. He was wrong about that last part. Dale Pruitt, the project manager, called him into the trailer 2 days later, sat him down across a metal desk covered in permit applications, and told him the columns had been reviewed by the company's internal engineering team and found to be within acceptable tolerance. No construction halt would be ordered. The timeline would continue. Elijah asked to see the internal review documents. Pruitt told him it was proprietary. Elijah escalated to the regional director. The regional director did not return his calls. Not that week, not the following week, not ever. 14 days after Elijah Cross filed his report, a section of scaffolding on the eastern span collapsed during a shift change. 4 workers were injured seriously enough to require hospitalization. 2 of them spent more than a month recovering. When the investigation started, Elijah went home to get his copy of the report. The filing cabinet was where it always was. He opened the third drawer. The folder was there. The papers were gone. Nothing else in the room had been touched. The dresser, the bookshelf, the box of Cora's baby photographs on the closet shelf, all of it exactly as it had been. Just the folder, just those documents. He stood in that room for a long time, holding an empty folder, and he understood with a clarity that was almost physical exactly what had happened and what it meant and what was going to happen next. He told the investigators he had filed the report. He described the contents in precise detail. He gave them the certified mail tracking number. The tracking number confirmed delivery. The Regional Safety Commission said they had no record of receiving anything from him. Without his copy, without the physical document in his hands, he was a man claiming he had warned people. The company had lawyers. The company had a paper trail that told a completely different story. And Elijah Cross had nothing but his word. The official investigation concluded 5 months later. The report named Elijah Cross as the primary individual responsible for the oversight failure on the Caldwell Crossing eastern span. It stated that he had failed to identify warning signs that any competent professional in his position should have caught. He was terminated this Monday after the report was released. Within 6 months, his name had circulated through every major contractor network in the region. His professional certifications were suspended pending review. The review opened and never closed. It didn't conclude with a finding. It just stayed open the way a wound stays open when it's never allowed to heal, because healing it would close the matter, and closing the matter was not in anyone's interest but his. There was one thing Elijah had never told anyone. Not Calvin Reed, his lawyer, who had done everything a man with limited resources could do to push back against the machine, and found it wasn't enough. Not Bernard Cole, who had watched everything unfold from the corner of Delwood and Marsh and had his own opinions about what it meant. Not Renata in the months before she got too sick for conversations about anything except what was immediate and necessary. 2 weeks after he was terminated, before Renata's condition had gotten bad enough that leaving was something he could no longer do, Elijah had driven downtown to the Harmon Infrastructure Group headquarters. The glass tower on Market Street, 40 floors, the kind of building that announced its own importance before you were close enough to read the name on it. He hadn't made an appointment. He hadn't called ahead. He had simply parked the car in a lot 2 blocks away, walked to the building, gone through the revolving door, and approached the security desk. He asked to see Richard Harmon. The security guard, a man about 50 with the particular patience of someone who had seen every version of this before, asked if Mr. Harmon was expecting him. Elijah said no. The guard made a call, waited, made another call, came back and said Mr. Harmon was unavailable, and would he like to leave a message or speak with someone in the HR department? Elijah said no. He stood in that lobby for 40 minutes, not shouting, not demanding, not making any kind of scene that would have given anyone a reason to remove him. Just standing near the security desk with his hands at his sides in the work clothes he had been wearing, looking at the elevator bank and the people who came and went from it, none of whom were Richard Harmon. At the end of 40 minutes, he left, walked back to the car, drove home. He had never told anyone about those 40 minutes because there was nothing to say about them that wouldn't sound like defeat, and it hadn't felt like defeat exactly. It had felt like something else, something he didn't have a word for, but that lived in him still, the specific experience of standing in a place where your presence was entirely irrelevant to the people with power over your life, of understanding firsthand, and without any remaining ambiguity, exactly how small the space was where your name mattered versus how large the space was where it didn't. He had learned something standing in that lobby. He had carried it home and put it in the same category as the other things he carried: the folder that had been emptied, the certification suspended without cause, the 6 years of invisible blacklisting, and he had continued. Because continuing was the only option that made sense when you had a child who needed you to continue. Renata had died 14 months after the termination. She had been in treatment for an aggressive autoimmune condition when Elijah lost his job. The treatment required regular infusion specialist appointments, medications that cost more each month than most people's car payments. All of it had been covered by the health insurance that came with the Harmon Infrastructure contract. All of it disappeared on the same day as the job. Elijah sold the car. He took on roofing work through a cousin who owed him a favor. Night shifts at a distribution warehouse in Bucks County, 2 towns over. He picked up whatever he could find and did it without complaint, because there was no room for complaint. There was only the next thing to be done. He borrowed money from his brother until his brother had nothing left to lend. He filed every appeal available to him. He wrote letters. He showed up in person at offices. He did everything a man with no institutional backing could do to push back against a system that had already decided what the story was going to be. It wasn't enough. Renata died in a hospital room in December. She was 37 years old. Elijah was holding her hand. Cora was 3 years old, asleep in the chair in the corner, curled under a donated blanket that had a cartoon giraffe on it, too young to understand, old enough that she would carry the shape of that room somewhere inside her for the rest of her life, even if she never remembered it clearly. After that, Elijah had stopped expecting anything from the world except the chance to raise his daughter without adding more damage to what she had already survived. He kept the house on Delwood Avenue. He found work where he could find it. He kept Cora in school, made sure she had what she needed. He swept the porch every morning and washed the dishes before bed, and kept her drawings on the hallway wall in careful straight rows, because the small dignities were the ones he could actually control. He didn't talk about Caldwell Crossing. Not ever. Not to anyone. He carried it the way a man carries something very heavy over a very long distance. Not because he forgot it was there, but because putting it down wasn't something he'd been given permission to do. On the porch, Sylvia Harmon stood at the bottom of the steps and waited. Behind Elijah, the screen door pushed open slightly and a small face appeared at elbow height. Cora, home from school, had come to see what was happening. She peered around her father's arm with the open, entirely unguarded attention of a child who hadn't yet learned that watching too closely could cost you something. She looked at Sylvia. She looked at her father's back. She looked at Sylvia again. Then she disappeared inside. Elijah hadn't moved from where he stood at the top of the steps. He looked at Sylvia Harmon standing on his front path with her hands at her sides and said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, with no particular inflection, "What's in the safe?" Sylvia met his eyes. "Your original warning report. All 4 pages of it. With the photographs. It's been there since the week of the collapse." She paused. "My father kept it. He didn't destroy it. He kept it." The street was completely still. Down the block, Bernard Cole had come out of the corner grocery with a broom, not sweeping, just standing there holding it, watching. A woman from number 38 had stopped on her front steps without appearing to have a reason to be on her front steps. Elijah was aware of all of it in the background, the way he was always aware of the details of a space he was in. But his attention was on the specific things Sylvia Harmon had just said, and the specific implications of it, and what it meant for a document to have been not destroyed, but preserved, and why a man would preserve a document that convicted him. Cora reappeared. She moved past her father's arm and came down one step carrying a glass of water in both hands, moving with the focused deliberateness of someone transporting something fragile. She stopped in front of Sylvia and held the glass up. Her expression was entirely serious. This was a transaction. It required proper execution. Sylvia took the glass. "Thank you." Cora nodded once. Then she retreated behind her father and stood there, one hand finding the back of his shirt, gripping it lightly. Not afraid. Just present the way she was always present, quiet and close, and entirely aware of what was happening around her. Elijah looked at his daughter. Then he looked back at Sylvia Harmon. "Why now?" he said. It was not the question she had expected. He could see that in the slight recalibration behind her eyes. She had prepared for other questions about the contents of the safe, about her intentions, about whether he believed her. She had not prepared for the mechanics of it. For a man asking not whether it was true, but why, after 6 years, Truth had chosen this particular Tuesday afternoon to show up at his address. Sylvia held his gaze. "Because I found it 9 weeks ago, and it took me this long to be certain of what it meant, and certain of what I was going to do about it." She paused. "I'm not certain it was long enough, but I wasn't going to come to you until I was as certain as I could make myself." It was not a perfect answer. He could hear in it the places where it was solid and the places where it was still being worked out. But it was honest, and honesty in his experience had a specific texture to it that was different from performance, and what Sylvia Harmon was doing on his front path did not feel like a performance. He looked at her for another long moment. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same time." He put his hand on Cora's shoulder and turned them both back toward the door. He didn't look at the sedan as he went inside. He didn't need to. He had been carrying the weight of a specific silence for 6 years. He did not know yet what he was going to do, but he knew that the weight had just changed shape. And sometimes that was the beginning of understanding how to put something down. Inside the hallway, drawings caught the afternoon light. The crayon houses, the stick figures with their enormous, hopeful hands, the purple horse that Cora still defended with complete conviction. Elijah looked at them for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen to start dinner because the day still needed to end, and the ending of a day, like the beginning of one, required something that could be completed. She came back the next day at the same time, and the day after that. Elijah did not invite her inside. He stood at the top of the steps. The first time sat in the metal porch chair, the second leaned against the railing, the third. Each position a small calibration, not toward warmth exactly, but away from the hardest version of distance. Sylvia seemed to understand this without being told. She took the lower step each time, the one closest to the path, and she never brought anything that looked like it was leading somewhere until she was ready to show him where it led. Cora watched from the doorway on the first day and from the porch swing on the second, doing her homework with one ear in the conversation and one eye on her father's face. She had the particular talent of children who grow up in close quarters with a single parent, the ability to read a room from across it, to know when something mattered without being told that it mattered. On the second afternoon, she brought out 2 glasses of water without being asked and set one on the step beside Sylvia and one on the railing beside her father, and went back to her homework without comment. Elijah watched her do it. Something shifted behind his eyes that he didn't name. Bernard Cole noticed the car on the second day. Elijah knew this because Bernard was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the grocery when he went for milk that evening, and Bernard swept the sidewalk in front of the grocery approximately once a week, and it was not that day of the week. Bernard swept slowly, methodically, in the direction of Elijah. "Same car," Bernard said, not looking up from the broom. "2 days running." "I know," Elijah said. Bernard swept a little further. "I've seen this before. Different car, different suit. Same story." He stopped and looked at Elijah with the directness of a man who had spent 23 years watching a neighborhood absorb things it shouldn't have had to absorb. They come in with apologies and leave with your signature on something you didn't fully read. Elijah held the milk at his side and didn't say anything. "She hasn't asked me to sign anything," he said finally. "Yet," Bernard said. He went back to sweeping. Elijah walked home. He sat with that word all evening. Yet. He turned it over the way he turned everything over these days, looking for where it was solid and where it wasn't, checking it against what he actually knew rather than what he feared. Bernard wasn't wrong about the pattern. The pattern was real, and it had happened in neighborhoods like this one to people who had far less to start with than they did when it was over. But a pattern was not a prophecy, and there was something about Sylvia Harmon that was difficult to fit into the pattern Bernard was describing. It wasn't her sincerity. Sincerity was easy to perform, and Elijah had watched people perform it his entire adult life. What was harder to explain was the specificity. She knew the exact date of his original warning report, not approximate exact. She knew the name of the city engineer who had commissioned an independent structural assessment of the Caldwell Crossing columns, a name that had never appeared in any public document related to the case. She knew details that couldn't have come from research or court records or anything that had ever been made available outside of a very specific set of documents. Documents that, as far as anyone had been able to establish for 6 years, no longer existed. He was still sitting at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock when he heard Cora's light click off upstairs. He looked up at the ceiling and listened to the house settle and thought about the folder in the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, the one that had been emptied 6 years ago, the one he still hadn't replaced with a different folder because something in him had needed the evidence of what had been taken to remain visible in that particular drawer. On the third afternoon, Sylvia brought an envelope. She didn't open it immediately. She sat on the lower step and talked about the process. First, the estate attorneys, the false panel in the home office wall, the quiet click of the lock, the specific feeling of cold that had moved through her before she even saw what was inside. She talked about hiring a private document examiner, the cross-referencing of dates across archived city records, the 2 weeks of work she had done before she was willing to trust what she was seeing. Elijah listened without interrupting. He had the patience of someone who had learned that the shape of information mattered as much as the information itself, and the shape of what Sylvia was describing, methodical, sequential, willing to be proven wrong before being proven right, had a different texture than the shape of something constructed to persuade. Then she opened the envelope. She took out 3 items and placed them on the step beside her. One at a time, the way you place things when you want a person to be able to look at each one fully before moving to the next. The first was a 4-page document with photographs clipped to the upper left corner. Elijah recognized it before he finished reading the first line. He recognized the font, the margins, the specific way he had structured the header with the project name and his employee ID number and the date typed in the upper right corner. He recognized the photographs, the 3 columns, the diagonal stress lines in the lower third, the specific angle he had crouched to in order to capture the depth of the fracture rather than just the surface. He recognized his own report because he had written it, and he had a memory for documents, the way some people have a memory for music, not just the content, but the physical form of the thing, the way it sat on the page, the weight of the language he had chosen, because precision had mattered, and he had wanted there to be no ambiguity in what he was saying. He read it, all 4 pages slowly, the way an engineer reads something he is checking against his own knowledge, not looking for what's there, but for whether what's there matches what he knows to be true. It did. Every word. He set it down carefully. The second document was 4 pages as well, official letterhead from the Philadelphia Department of Public Infrastructure. Dr. Sandra Pruitt, senior structural engineer. Dated 11 days before Elijah had filed his own report, meaning it had been commissioned before the collapse, meaning someone at the city level had already identified the same problem Elijah had identified and had put that identification into writing. He read it with the specific attention of someone cross-referencing a finding against their own professional memory. Diagonal stress fractures in the load-bearing columns of the eastern span. Risk of structural failure under operational load. Recommendation, immediate construction, halt pending full independent review. He read it twice, set it beside his own report on the porch railing. The third item was a single page, handwritten. The letterhead of Harmon Infrastructure Group embossed at the top in the way Richard Harmon had apparently put his name on everything: the building, the stationery, the public record, his own children. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the writing of a man accustomed to his words carrying finality. It was addressed to Dale Pruitt. 3 sentences. Keep the timeline, adjust documentation after the fact if necessary. I'll manage the board. Elijah read those 3 sentences. Then he read them again. He was looking for a different way to understand them, a context that would make them mean something other than what they clearly meant. There wasn't one. There had never been one. He had suspected this for 6 years, had known the general shape of it, without being able to see its specific edges, and now here were the edges in handwriting, with initials at the bottom. His jaw tightened once, a small movement. Then his face went still again, and he kept reading. Not because there was more to read on that page, but because he needed a moment inside the act of reading before he was ready to look up. He set the memo on top of the other 2 documents. He looked out at the street. A car was passing at the far end of the block. Bernard's grocery sign was lit against the early evening gray. Someone in the house at number 30 had a television on, the sound faint and indistinct through the window. "There's more," Sylvia said quietly. Elijah looked at her. She reached into the envelope and took out one more item. She held it for a moment before she handed it to him, and in that moment he could see on her face the specific difficulty of what she was about to do. Not guilt, which was a manageable feeling, but something more precise and harder to carry. The knowledge that you are about to hand someone a pain they didn't know the exact shape of yet. It was a letter. 1 page, Elijah's own handwriting. He had written this letter the week after his termination. He remembered sitting at this kitchen table. Not the current table, the old one. The one Renata had liked because it was wide enough for her to spread her work across, and writing to Richard Harmon directly. Not to the HR department or the legal team or any of the institutional intermediaries he had already tried and failed to reach. To the man himself. He had written carefully, precisely, without anger, because anger would have given them a reason to dismiss it. He had described what he had found and what he had reported and what had happened to the report and what it had cost him. He had mailed it to the Market Street address with a return address and a real stamp, and the particular desperate precision of a man who has tried every other option. He had never received a response. He had assumed the letter was discarded, unread, lost in the machinery of a large organization's mailroom, or deliberately intercepted. He had filed it in the category of things he had done correctly that had made no difference, the longest and most expensive category of his adult life. In the upper right corner of the letter in Richard Harmon's precise handwriting were 6 words. Dealt with. DP to follow up. Elijah sat with that for a long time. He had written to Richard Harmon. Richard Harmon had read the letter, had held it in his hands, had understood exactly who had written it and exactly what it described and exactly what it meant that the description was accurate, and had written 6 words in the corner and passed it to Dale Pruitt and put it in a safe and gone on with his day. Dealt with. The street outside was doing that thing October streets in Philadelphia did in the early evening, going from gray to the particular blue dark that settled in before the streetlights fully compensated. Somewhere down the block a screen door banged. A child called something to someone inside. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening on an ordinary street. He read it, Elijah said. His voice was very quiet. Not broken, not loud, just very quiet and sitting directly on top of the truth. He read my letter. Yes, Sylvia said. And 4 days after the report, I filed 4 men got hurt. Yes. He was silent for a long time after that. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of a man sitting with a truth he had suspected for 6 years and was now holding confirmed in both hands, and finding that confirmation felt nothing like what he had expected it to feel like. He had expected something like relief or anger or the cold, clarifying satisfaction of being proven right. What he actually felt was something closer to grief. Not new grief, the same grief he had been carrying, but now it had its exact dimensions. And sometimes knowing the exact dimensions of a thing was worse than carrying its approximate weight, because the exact dimensions had edges that the approximate weight did not. Cora appeared in the doorway. She looked at the documents on the porch railing. She looked at her father's face. She looked at Sylvia. Then she went back inside, and they heard her in the kitchen opening the refrigerator, moving around in the way she moved when she was giving something space without being told to. "This is your story," Sylvia said. "I won't tell it without your permission." Elijah nodded slowly once. He stood and gathered the documents and placed them carefully back in the envelope. Not keeping them, he understood implicitly they were Sylvia's to hold. But the act of handling them with care felt important. These were documents that had been handled carelessly enough by enough people already. He handed the envelope back. "I need a few days," he said. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. Elijah found it in the mailbox between the water bill and a grocery circular. Plain white envelope. Return address he didn't recognize immediately, and then did Meridian Asset Recovery, LLC, a suite number in Center City. He opened it at the kitchen table while Cora ate breakfast across from him. He read it once, then he read it again. The letter informed him that an outstanding legal obligation of $24,000 described as administrative and processing costs incurred during the Caldwell Crossing Bridge safety investigation had been transferred to Meridian Asset Recovery, LLC, for collection. Payment was due within 30 days. Failure to pay would initiate civil proceedings and could result in a lien being placed on his property at the listed address. His property, this house, the house where Cora was eating cereal 8 feet away, asking if she could go to her friend Danny's after school on Friday. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his back pocket. "Friday's fine," he said. He waited until she was on the bus. Then he went to the backyard and called Sylvia. She answered on the first ring. He read her the letter. The silence that followed told him two things simultaneously. She hadn't known about it, and she understood immediately what it was. "It's not a debt," she said. "There were no administrative costs assessed against you during the investigation. I read every document from that proceeding. Nothing like this exists in the record." "I know what it is," Elijah said. "I can have this dissolved in a week. My attorney can—" "No." The word came out harder than he intended. He steadied himself. "No, I won't have you paying off threats made against me by your company's people. If you pay it, then every time I walk through that door, I'll know this house was protected by Harmon money. I can't live in that." A pause. "I understand," Sylvia said. "I won't touch it." He stood in the backyard after the call ended, looking up at the second-floor window. Cora's room, the curtains she had chosen herself blue with small white stars. He had held this house for 11 years. Through the worst years, through the months when he genuinely didn't know how he was going to manage the mortgage, through the years of invisible blacklisting, and the particular grinding humiliation of being a competent man who could not find work in his actual field. He had held it. But something had shifted. The letter had done something that all the years of accumulated damage had not quite done. It had made the other side visible and present and specific. For 6 years, what had happened to him had existed mostly as absence. The absence of work, the absence of Renata, the absence of his name from records it should have been part of. The harm was real, but it was also diffuse, spread across years, hard to point at directly. The letter was different. The letter had a return address, it had a dollar amount, it had a deadline, and it had used the one specific thing that was entirely and only his, this house, the one his daughter grew up in, the one with the creaking third step and the kitchen window that stuck in summer as a pressure point. He went inside. He picked up his phone and opened the contact for Calvin Reed. Calvin had passed the bar exam after a long detour through construction management, which was how they had met on a job site, two men with technical backgrounds who ended up on the same crew for 6 months and had stayed in contact, the way men sometimes stayed in contact, not frequently but genuinely. Elijah typed, "Need to talk." Not urgent, but important. This week if you can. He set the phone down and started making Cora's lunch for the next day. Calvin Reed came to the house on a Wednesday evening and sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his yellow legal pad and laid everything out in the plain, unadorned language he used when the situation didn't have room for anything else. He was 51, stocky, with close-cut gray at his temples, and the particular unhurried quality of a man who had learned that rushing through difficult information didn't make the information less difficult, it just made it less understood. He explained the civil filing threat. Meridian Asset Recovery, LLC, was a shell he was almost certain connected to Harmon Infrastructure's legal operations at a distance of one or two corporate layers, enough distance to create plausible separation, not enough to actually separate it if someone looked carefully. The filing itself was designed not to collect $24,000. It was designed to create a legal record. If the 30-day window expired without payment, they would file an amended complaint. The amended complaint would trigger a discovery hold on any related documentation. If Sylvia Harmon's evidence was what Elijah understood it to be, that evidence, once it became part of any legal proceeding, even a civil collections case, could be locked in discovery for 18 months at minimum, possibly longer. They're not trying to take your house, Calvin said. They're trying to buy time. Specifically, they're trying to buy time before you can make anything public. How much time do we have? Elijah asked. 9 days before the amended filing window opens. Calvin turned a page on his pad. There's something else. He looked at Elijah steadily. Harmon Infrastructure's board is meeting this Friday. My understanding from a contact I have in the commercial real estate sector, who has board-adjacent visibility, is that they're not just discussing administrative leave for Sylvia Harmon. They're preparing to vote on termination with cause. What cause? Unauthorized disclosure of proprietary company information. If they vote to terminate her before anything goes public, they establish a legal argument that anything she releases afterward is the result of a breach of fiduciary duty. Calvin set his pen down. It poisons the evidence before it reaches anyone who can use it. Elijah sat with that. So if they file before we act, he said, the evidence is compromised. And if they terminate Sylvia before we act, the evidence is also compromised. That's the shape of it, Calvin said. You have 9 days, probably 8 given how Friday lands. After Calvin left, Elijah washed the cups and stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the backyard in the dark. He thought about what Calvin had said. He thought about the letter in his back pocket and the folder on Sylvia's kitchen table and the 3 sentences in Richard Harmon's handwriting. He thought about 40 minutes in a lobby on Market Street 6 years ago, standing perfectly still while the world went about its business around him. He was done standing still. The next morning, before he called Sylvia, before he called Calvin back with any decisions, Elijah did something he had not done before. He opened his phone to a contact he had not called in 3 years, a name he had stored without being certain he would ever use it. Diane Okafor, investigative journalist, Philadelphia Courier. She had reached out to him 3 years ago, 18 months after the official investigation had closed, when a source had apparently pointed her toward the inconsistencies in the Caldwell Crossing report. She had called twice. He had not returned either call. He had been deep in the calculation then that silence was the safest thing for Cora, that drawing attention back to his name meant drawing attention back to everything, and everything was a cost he couldn't pay. He had been wrong about that, or at least he had been wrong about whether silence kept the cost from coming anyway. He looked at her name on his screen for a long moment. Then he pressed call. She picked up on the 3rd ring. He could hear in the background that she was somewhere with other people. An office, the particular ambient sound of a newsroom still functioning in the age of everything digital. This is Elijah Cross, he said. You called me 3 years ago about Caldwell Crossing. A brief silence, the kind of silence that meant she remembered and was recalibrating quickly. I did, she said. I didn't call back. No. I'm calling back now. He paused. I have terms. Another silence. When she spoke again, the ambient noise behind her had reduced. She had moved somewhere quieter, he realized. I'm listening, she said. What I tell you, you verify independently before you publish. I give you what I know firsthand. I tell you clearly when something is my interpretation versus my direct knowledge. You don't run anything based only on my word. You corroborate it or it doesn't go in. Those are reasonable terms, Diane said, and nothing about my daughter. Her name doesn't appear anywhere. Not in the story, not in a caption, not in any context. Agreed without reservation. Elijah looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, the rusted chair, the square of gray morning sky between the rooflines. I also need to know what you already have, because I'm not going to build something on top of information that's wrong. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 3 years ago, I had inconsistencies in the official timeline and two sources who would speak off the record about pressure being applied to the investigation process. I had nothing I could publish. I still have those sources. I've been continuing to dig quietly. A pause. What I don't have is documents. I may be able to address that, Elijah said, but not yet. There are things that need to happen first. He told her he would be in touch within the week. He ended the call and stood in the kitchen for a moment, feeling the specific difference between the man who had walked past those calls 3 years ago and the man who had just made one. It was not a dramatic difference in the way dramatic things announce themselves. It was quieter than that, more structural. Like the difference in a building when a load-bearing wall is moved from one position to another. Nothing visible changes immediately, but the weight is being carried differently now, and everything that comes next will be shaped by that. John. Warren Galt came to Delwood Avenue on a Friday afternoon. Elijah knew who he was before he was introduced. 61 years old, trim, dark suit. The kind of man who arrived early to every meeting, because being early was a form of professional aggression he had long since stopped being aware of. Harmon Infrastructure's chief legal officer for 19 years. The man whose name appeared throughout the email chain Sylvia had shown him, always at the end of a thread, always with the final word that redirected everything toward the company's preferred position. Galt parked his own car, not a company car. Elijah noted the kind of detail that was telling directly behind Sylvia's sedan at the curb. He sat in it for 2 minutes before getting out. Elijah watched from the front window. Galt was looking at the house. He was reading the address, reading the street, doing the kind of assessment that men in his position did automatically before entering any space. Elijah opened the front door before Galt reached the porch steps. Galt stopped. He recalibrated slightly, the way a man recalibrates when the choreography of an encounter doesn't follow the script he had prepared. He came up the steps and extended his hand. Elijah shook it. "Warren Galt," Galt said. "I was hoping we could speak privately." "We can speak here," Elijah said. He did not invite him inside. He stepped out onto the porch and stood near the railing, hands at his sides, giving the space without giving the advantage of interior walls. Galt came onto the porch. He looked around once at the chair at the door at the street, and then he looked at Elijah with the precise, unhurried assessment of a man checking an adversary's positioning before deciding how to begin. "I'll be direct," Galt said. "I'd prefer it," Elijah said. "You're in contact with Sylvia Harmon. She's shown you documents from her father's personal files. I understand that those documents may have given you reason to revisit certain aspects of the Caldwell Crossing investigation." Galt paused. "I'm here because I believe there's a path to resolution that serves everyone's interest and avoids outcomes that would cause significant harm to a significant number of people." "Significant number," Elijah said. "The company employs 4,000 people in this region. A public proceeding of the kind that Ms. Harmon appears to be contemplating would create disruptions that would ultimately fall hardest on people who had nothing to do with any decision made 6 years ago." Elijah looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of hesitation, but the quiet of a man who is listening for the specific thing that hasn't been said yet, the thing that will tell him what the actual offer is. "What is it you're proposing?" Elijah said. Galt reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. He held it out. Elijah took it, opened it, read the first paragraph. It was a settlement framework. Structured payment, confidential acknowledgement of certain historical employment, matters non-disclosure provisions. The number was significant, more than he would see in 3 years of tile work, more than he had seen in any single document since the termination letter. He read through it, all of it carefully, the way he read any document he was being asked to respond to. He was aware of Galt watching him, aware of the specific patience of a man who was accustomed to waiting out this part of the process, because experience had taught him that most people, when faced with a large enough number on a piece of paper, eventually found a way to rationalize accepting it. Elijah folded the document and held it out to Galt. No, he said. Galt didn't take the document immediately. He looked at it in Elijah's extended hand. You haven't had time to... I don't need more time, Elijah said. I understand what this is. He kept his hand extended until Galt took the document back. You drove down here today because you knew Sylvia Harmon wasn't going to accept this. She already made that clear to you. So you came here to see if I would. He looked at Galt steadily. The answer is no, not because of the number, because of what accepting it would mean. Every morning I walk into this house, I'd be walking into something that was purchased to keep me quiet. I'm not going to do that. Galt held his gaze for a moment. The quality of his attention shifted slightly, not toward respect exactly, but toward the specific recalibration of a man who has encountered a variable he had not adequately accounted for. The board meets next Friday, Galt said. Before that meeting, the situation will become significantly more complicated. I'd encourage you to think carefully. I have been thinking carefully, Elijah said. For 6 years. Galt put the document back inside his jacket. He nodded once, the minimal nod of a man who was acknowledging that this particular door was closed without conceding that it should be. He went back down the porch steps, down the path into his car. He drove away without looking back. Elijah stood on the porch until the car was out of sight. Then he went inside. Cora was at the kitchen table with her homework. She looked up at him when he came through the door with the specific evaluating look she had, the one that asked without asking whether something needed to be explained or whether it was something she should simply file for later. He sat down across from her. What are you working on? He said. Fractions, she said. She looked back down at her worksheet, then she looked up again. Was that man trying to buy something? Elijah looked at his daughter. Something like that, he said. She nodded the considered nod of someone who had already suspected as much. Did you sell it? No, he said. She looked back at her fractions. Good, she said in the tone she used when a thing was exactly what she expected it to be, and she was satisfied and ready to move on. Elijah sat across from her and watched her work and felt underneath everything else the specific clarity that comes when a decision has been made and the making of it is behind you. That night, after Cora's light clicked off and the house settled into its particular late-night sounds, Elijah sat at the kitchen table. He didn't look at the letter from Meridian Asset Recovery. He had read it enough times to have it memorized, and memorizing it had been sufficient. He looked instead at the hallway, at the drawings taped in careful rows, the crayon houses with their yellow windows, the stick figures with their enormous hands, the purple horse. He thought about what Calvin had said, 9 days. He thought about what Diane Okafor had said, I've been continuing to dig quietly. He thought about Warren Galt on his porch, recalibrating again, finally understanding that there was no number on a page that was going to close this. He thought about 40 minutes in a lobby on Market Street 6 years ago, not with bitterness, with the particular clarity of a man using the past to understand the present, what that experience had taught him, what he had learned standing there about the space where his name mattered versus the space where it didn't, and how that space had now, with specific and irrevocable finality, changed. He picked up his phone. He sent Sylvia a message. 7 in the morning. I need to go through all of it again. Every document in order. And I have something to tell you about a call I made. He set the phone down on the table. He sat there until the tea he had made went cold. Then he rinsed the cup, set it on the rack, turned off the kitchen light. He went upstairs. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt for the first time in 6 years the specific sensation of a man who is not waiting for something to happen to him, but moving deliberately and with his eyes open towards something he has decided to make happen himself. The house settled around him. Down the hall, Cora slept, one hand probably tucked under her chin the way it always was. The third step from the bottom creaked in the wind. He closed his eyes. 8 days. The morning of the press conference, Elijah's alarm went off at 5:15. He didn't fight it. He lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the house, the way he always listened to it at this hour, the pipe in the wall, the floor in the hallway, the particular silence of Delwood Avenue, before the street remembered it was a street and began acting like one. Then he got up dressed in the dark and went downstairs. He made coffee. While it brewed, he stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The rusted chair, the square of pale pre-dawn sky between the roof lines. He thought about what the day was going to contain and he let himself think about it plainly without flinching away from the parts that were difficult, because he had found over the past 8 days that flinching away from difficult things cost more energy than simply looking at them directly. Then he went upstairs and opened the closet. The blue shirt was on the left side where it had always been. Renata had bought it at a department store sale 7 years ago, the kind of sale where she moved through the racks with the focused efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking for and recognized it when she found it. She had held it up against his shoulders in the aisle and said it was the right blue. He had worn it to their neighbor's retirement dinner that fall and to Cora's kindergarten graduation 3 years later. And then he had stopped wearing it because at some point it had become the shirt he wore to things that mattered. And for a long time, nothing had mattered in the right way. He put it on. It still fit. Some things held their shape. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment, not rehearsing, not posturing, just looking at the face of a man who was 42 years old and had been carrying the wrong name attached to the wrong story for 6 years and was about to do something about that in front of cameras and journalists and whatever the morning was going to bring. He went to Cora's room. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed in the burgundy jacket she saved for school picture days and the occasional Sunday when they went to church, her hair brushed without being asked, her hands folded in her lap, with the particular composed readiness of someone who had been waiting for this to start. He stood in the doorway. "You didn't have to dress yet," he said. "Ba Albers isn't coming until noon." "I know," Cora said. "I wanted to be ready." He looked at her for a moment. This person who had been 3 years old in a hospital room and had grown in the years since into someone he could not fully explain, someone he had tried to protect, and who had been quietly, efficiently, completely watching out for him right back without once asking for acknowledgement of it. "You look nice," he said. "So do you," she said with the gravity she brought to things she meant. He made her breakfast. She ate. He drank his coffee. The morning light came through the kitchen window at its low October angle and fell across the table between them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything. This was the particular gift of the life they had built in this kitchen over 8 years, the ability to be in the same silence without it being empty. At 7:40, his phone lit up on the table. "Sylvia, attorney confirmed. Everything is set. See you at 10. He set the phone face down and finished his coffee. He had told Cora the night before. Not everything. Enough. He had sat on the edge of her bed with the lamp on and talked to her the way he always talked to her about hard things directly, without pretending they were simpler than they were, with the steady certainty that she could handle more than most people assumed because she always had. He told her that a long time ago, before she was old enough to remember he had a job he was good at and proud of, that he had found a serious problem at a construction site and reported it because that was his job and it was the right thing to do, that the people in charge hadn't listened and people got hurt, and afterward his name got put on the wrong side of what happened, credited with the failure instead of the warning. He told her that the woman who had been coming to their porch was the daughter of the man who had made those decisions, that she had found documents her father kept that showed what had actually happened, that tomorrow they were both going to a room full of journalists and cameras, and they were going to tell that story out loud in public for the record. Cora had listened the way she listened to everything completely, without fidgeting, without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Is it scary?" "Yes," Elijah said without hesitating. "But you're doing it anyway." "Yes." She considered this, folded it into whatever internal framework she used to organize the world. Then she said, "Is it because of me?" He looked at his daughter, not accusatory in how she asked it, just asking the way she always asked the real questions directly because she wanted the actual answer and could tell the difference between that and the comfortable version. "Partly," he said honestly, "and partly because it's the right thing to do." She nodded slowly, the considered nod, then like filing the report. He looked at her. Exactly like that. She reached over and pulled her blanket up and settled back against the pillow. He sat there for another moment, the lamp throwing its small warm circle in the corner of the room, the sounds of Delwood Avenue at night coming through the window. She always wanted cracked open slightly. "Hey, Dad." "Yeah?" "The drawings in the hallway." A pause. "You never took them down." He looked at her. "I used to think you just forgot," she said, "but I don't think that anymore." He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She was right. He had never forgotten. He had looked at those drawings every single morning for years, and they had been in ways he had never put into precise language until this moment, exactly the kind of small dignity a man holds on to when the larger ones have been taken from him. "Get some sleep," he said. She closed her eyes. He turned off the lamp and stood in the hallway for a moment with the door pulled mostly shut, looking at the rows of drawings in the dark. The crayon houses, the stick figures, the purple horse. Then he went downstairs and made himself a cup of tea he didn't particularly want, but that gave his hands something to do while he sat at the kitchen table and let everything settle into its proper weight. The hotel on Clement Street was 8 blocks from the courthouse. Mid-sized neutral, the kind of place that hosted regional conferences and retirement parties, and occasionally press events for people who needed ground that didn't belong to anyone in particular. No Harmon infrastructure branding anywhere in the building. Sylvia had checked personally twice. Elijah arrived at 9:40. Sylvia was already there, standing in the hallway outside the meeting room with her attorney, a woman named Carol Reeves, efficient and unsentimental, in the specific way of someone who had done this before and understood which details mattered and which ones were noise. They shook hands. Carol walked Elijah through the sequence quickly. Sylvia would speak first. The evidence would be presented in order. Elijah would be offered the opportunity to speak after, but there was no obligation. "I'll speak," Elijah said. Carol nodded, made a note. At 9:50, he went into the room. 14 journalists, 2 television cameras positioned along the left wall, recording equipment on the table at the front. The low preparatory murmur of people who were waiting for something they understood was significant. Elijah walked to the back row and chose the seat closest to the wall nearest the door. Habit. He had always liked to know where the exit was. He sat down, put his hands flat on his thighs, breathed. At 10:02, Mrs. Albers arrived with Cora. They came in quietly without drawing attention, and Cora found Elijah, immediately walked directly to him and sat in the seat beside him without saying anything. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided were important. Mrs. Albers sat on Cora's other side and patted her hand once, and then was simply present the way good neighbors are, without needing to be anything other than a steady body in a seat. At 10:05, Sylvia Harmon walked to the front of the room. She stood behind the small podium without notes. She did not grip its edges. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked out at the cameras and the journalists and all the recording devices pointed at her and began to speak. She spoke for 22 minutes. She described finding the safe, sitting on the floor of her father's home office in the dark after the post-funeral reception ended, still in the dress she'd worn all day, undoing the rubber band on a manila folder labeled in her father's handwriting. She described reading her father's memo by the light of her phone, sitting with those 3 sentences, looking for a way to understand them differently and not finding one. She described hiring a private document examiner, the 2 weeks of cross-referencing, the process she had committed to before she allowed herself to act on what she was seeing, because acting on it meant going to a specific man's house on a specific street and handing him something that was going to cause damage, regardless of how carefully it was offered, and she had wanted to be certain. She described the contents of the safe in sequence: the original warning report, the independent structural assessment from Dr. Sandra Pruitt, the internal email chain, the memo. She stated clearly, without the softening vocabulary of institutional communications, that Elijah Cross had identified the structural problem at Caldwell Crossing Bridge, had filed a proper report through correct channels, had been deliberately removed from the official record to protect the company's timeline and financial position. She stated that her father had read the report, had understood its implications, had chosen to suppress it, had read the letter Elijah sent him afterward, and passed it to Dale Pruitt with 6 words written in the corner. She did not say mistakes were made. She did not say missteps or oversights or a failure of process or any of the language organizations used to describe deliberate decisions they wished to reframe as accidents. She said, "My father made a choice. It was a wrong choice made with full awareness of its consequences for another person and his family. I am here because that choice has to be named for what it was." Then she reached under the podium and produced the small portable speaker in the drive. She looked out at the room. "I'm going to play a recorded phone call," she said. It has been verified for authenticity by 3 independent forensic audio firms. The verification reports are included in the documentation packet being distributed to each of you now. She connected the drive. She pressed play. Richard Harmon's voice filled the room, low and hurried, carrying the complete ease of a man who had spent 40 years being the most consequential person in any space he occupied and had long since stopped noticing it. He was talking to Dale Pruitt. The call was dated 4 days before the collapse of the Caldwell Crossing scaffolding. Richard told Pruitt to keep the crew on schedule. He said the column assessment had been handled internally and the findings were acceptable. When Pruitt mentioned that the safety supervisor had escalated his concerns to the Regional Safety Commission, Richard said, "That's been managed. If anything happens on site, we document it as equipment failure. The supervisor's report doesn't exist officially, so it can't be cited. Make sure Galt knows the timeline on the filing." The recording ended. The room was absolutely still, not the polite, attentive quiet of people listening to a presentation. Something different. The specific silence that falls when a room full of people hear something they understand is true and understand simultaneously that it changes something, that the shape of a thing they thought they knew has just been corrected permanently, and the corrected version cannot be put back. Sylvia waited one full beat. Then she said Elijah Cross filed that report. He did his job completely and correctly. What was done to him afterward was deliberate. The record should reflect that. A journalist near the front raised her hand. "Does Mr. Cross wish to make a statement?" Shem. Elijah stood. He walked from the back row to the front of the room slowly. Not performing slowness, just moving at the pace he moved when something mattered, and steadiness was the thing the moment required. He stood beside Sylvia. He looked out at the cameras, the journalists, the recording devices, all of it pointed at him. He was aware of Cora sitting in the back row. He was aware of the particular quality of the light in this room coming from the east-facing windows, the same low October angle it always had in this city at this hour. For the first time in 6 years, he was standing in a public space, and his name was not attached to the wrong story. He felt something he had not anticipated. Not triumph, not the electric relief of vindication he had sometimes imagined in the difficult years when imagining it was the only thing available. Something quieter than either of those things. A solidity, a sense of the ground beneath his feet being level, of standing on terrain that was actually his, that actually reflected what was true. He spoke without notes. His voice was steady, not loud, not performing anything. "I did my job," he said. "I identified a problem. I documented it. I reported it through every proper channel available to me. What happened after that was not my failure." He paused. "I've spent 6 years carrying a name that didn't belong to me. Today I want the record to reflect what actually happened." Another pause. "I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because my daughter is sitting in the back of this room, and I want her to understand that the truth is worth saying out loud, even when it costs something." He looked out at the room, especially then. He walked back to his seat. Cora looked up at him when he sat down. She didn't say anything. She reached over and put her hand on top of his and left it there. Harmon Infrastructure issued a statement within 2 hours. The evidence had been selectively presented. The audio recording was unverified and potentially altered. The company was committed to a thorough internal review of the claims made and would respond fully through appropriate legal channels. Warren Galt appeared on a local business news program that evening. He was precise and composed and used the word context 17 times in 8 minutes. He said nothing that could be directly refuted while saying nothing that was entirely honest. He had been managing situations like this for 19 years. He was good at it. The board voted to place Sylvia on administrative leave pending an internal review of her conduct as incoming CEO. The vote was 7-2. She received the notification by email at 4:17 that afternoon. She read it. She set her phone down. She made a cup of tea. She had expected it. She had planned for it. It still landed with a particular weight, the way expected things sometimes did when they stopped being abstract and became actual. But the documents were already public. The audio file had already been downloaded and shared and was moving through channels that no communications team could slow down, let alone stop. By midnight, the recording had been picked up by 2 regional news outlets and a national construction industry publication that had been tracking the Caldwell Crossing story off and on since a brief moment of attention during the original investigation years ago. The forensic verification reports were attached to every share. The first crack in the official response came the following morning. Diane Okafor had been working the Caldwell Crossing story for 3 years. She had sources but no documents. The press conference gave her the documents, and the documents gave her traction with sources who had previously been unwilling to speak on record. She published 48 hours after the press conference. Her story ran with a certified mail tracking record she had obtained through a public records request, a record showing delivery of Elijah's original report to the Regional Safety Commission, and with an Internal Safety Commission memo dated the week of delivery, directing the receiving staff to log the item as undeliverable due to insufficient sender information. Someone had received that report. Someone had written a memo about it. Someone had made a decision about how to categorize it, and that decision had been made in writing, and that writing had been sitting in a filing cabinet for 6 years. This was no longer a story about a company suppressing an internal report. This was a story about coordination between a private company and a public regulatory body. The shape of it was different. The implications of it were different. And the people whose names might appear in a more thorough investigation of it were different people than the ones who had been managing the situation until now. The story didn't stay regional. By the end of the first week, a state-level oversight committee announced it was opening an independent review of the Caldwell Crossing investigation and 3 other infrastructure projects completed by Harmon Infrastructure during the same period. The announcement used the phrase systemic documentation concerns 4 times. 2 former Harmon Infrastructure employees contacted news outlets independently within days of each other. The first was a construction technician who had worked on the Caldwell Crossing project. He stated that in the weeks following the collapse, he had been asked to sign an internal review document, a document describing an inspection of the eastern span columns that he had not conducted. He had signed it. He had been 26 years old and had needed the job. He had been carrying it since. The second was a project coordinator who had processed correspondence through Richard Harmon's office for 7 years. She confirmed on record that Richard Harmon had maintained a practice of recording calls with project directors and senior contractors. The recording Sylvia had released, she said, was entirely consistent with the format and quality of recordings she had observed throughout her time at the company. Elijah's account was no longer one man's word against an institution. Warren Galt retained personal legal counsel the following Monday. 2 board members resigned quietly on a Thursday afternoon, within 3 hours of each other releasing identical 2-line statements saying they were stepping down to pursue other opportunities. The statements were so similar in phrasing that several journalists noted it in print. The civil filing threat from Meridian Asset Recovery, LLC, was withdrawn. No explanation, no communication. The case number was voided. The lien threat dissolved. It was as if the letter had never been sent. Elijah received confirmation from Calvin Reed on a Tuesday morning. He stood in the kitchen and read the email twice. Then he set the phone down and stood with his hand on the counter for a moment. He had held this house for 11 years. Through the worst of it, through the months when he genuinely hadn't known how he was going to manage the mortgage, through the years of blacklisting and suspended certifications, through the particular grinding weight of being a competent man who could not find work in his own field. He had held it. It was still his, entirely his. No one else's money had touched it. He made breakfast and waited for Cora to come downstairs. 6 weeks after the press conference, a letter arrived from the Pennsylvania State Professional Licensing Board. Not a collection notice, not a legal threat. A formal letter on official state letterhead addressed to Elijah Cross informing him that the suspension of his professional engineering certifications, initiated in the aftermath of the Caldwell Crossing Bridge investigation, had been reviewed by the board and found to have been based on documentation that did not accurately represent the events in question. His certifications were reinstated effective immediately. Attached to the letter was a written acknowledgement, 1 page signed by the board chair. It stated that the original suspension had been issued on the basis of falsified investigative materials and did not reflect any professional deficiency on the part of Elijah Cross. It stated that the board's official record had been amended accordingly. He read it 3 times. It was a piece of paper, 1 page, official letterhead, formal language, a signature at the bottom. It was also the first time in 6 years that a document with any institutional authority had stated in writing with a signature attached that what happened to him was not his fault. That the record, the permanent official, publicly accessible record, said something different now than it had said yesterday. He folded it carefully and took it upstairs to the spare bedroom. He opened the filing cabinet. Third drawer. He took out a new folder from the small stack he kept in the bottom of the drawer, and he wrote his own name on the tab in his own handwriting, and he placed the letter inside and he closed the drawer. Then he stood in that room for a moment. This was the room where the folder had been emptied 6 years ago. He had stood in this exact spot holding an empty folder and understanding what had happened with a clarity that was almost physical. He stood in the same spot now and understood something different with the same kind of clarity that what had been taken from this room had, through a long and costly and imperfect process, been returned to it. Not everything that had been taken. Some things could not be returned. Some losses did not have a corresponding restoration, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. But this he could hold in his hands. He went downstairs and started making Cora's lunch. Sylvia Harmon resigned from Harmon Infrastructure on a Monday morning 3 months after the press conference. The board had made clear that administrative leave would become permanent termination with cause if she did not resign first. They had attorneys prepared to file. They had a narrative constructed. She resigned before they could take the choice away from her on her own terms, on her own timeline. Her public statement was 7 words: "I was not willing to inherit the silence." She had already begun the work that came next. The Caldwell Bridge Labor Trust was established with a portion of her personal assets, not the company's money, her own accumulated over years of distributions, and the inheritance of growing up as the daughter of a man who had built something large on a foundation she now understood completely. The trust was designated to support workers who had been displaced or harmed by Harmon infrastructure projects over the preceding decade. She did not name it after herself. She did not name it after her father. She named it after the bridge because she believed that the place where something goes wrong should be remembered and not erased. That erasure was precisely how the wrong thing happened again. She spent the months that followed building something smaller, a new consultancy, a small team, community infrastructure projects with labor transparency and independent safety oversight written into every contract from the first day, not as a public relations gesture, but as the actual structure of how the work would be done. It was smaller than anything the Harmon name had ever been attached to. She found she didn't mind. She found that the smallness was part of what made it feel real. She could see the whole of it. She could be accountable for it in the direct, specific, personal way that accountability required. The Eastbrook Community Center dedication was held on a Saturday morning in February. It was 2 miles from Delwood Avenue, a modest single-story building with large south-facing windows and a small plaza out front where a young tree had been planted the day before, held upright by 3 wooden stakes and the specific optimism of new things. Sylvia had called Elijah 2 weeks earlier. "The first project is finished. We're having a small dedication Saturday morning. You consulted on the foundation specifications. I thought you might want to see it." He had said, "We'll be there." The morning was clear and cold the way February mornings in Philadelphia sometimes were, the kind of cold that felt clean rather than brutal. The sky a flat, pale blue with no clouds anywhere. Elijah and Cora arrived at 10:09. Cora got out of the car and looked at the building with her arms already crossed and her head slightly tilted, the posture she had developed for evaluating structures. She walked the full perimeter before going inside. Elijah watched her stop at each corner and look up at the roofline, crouch briefly near the foundation at the northeast corner, where he had flagged a drainage concern during the specification review and recommended an additional moisture barrier. She seemed to find what she was looking for there. She stood, nodded to herself, continued. Inside the space was good work, clean solved, done right. He looked up at the ceiling joists and the lighting track and the HVAC distribution, all the invisible infrastructure that held the building together and made it function and read it the way he had always read structures. And what he read was competence and care, the kind of work a man could stand behind without qualification. Bernard Cole was there. Elijah hadn't known he was coming. He hadn't seen him arrive. Bernard came to stand beside him in the main room, both of them looking up at the ceiling for a moment, in the way that men who have spent time around construction look at buildings, reading them rather than simply observing them. Then Bernard looked at Elijah. "You did good," he said. 2 words. Not an apology. Bernard Cole was not a man who turned acknowledgments into speeches. He said what needed to be said in the fewest words, that would carry the full weight of it, and then he was done. Elijah understood this about him. It was one of the things he had always understood about Bernard. "Thank you, Bernard," Elijah said. Bernard nodded, went to get coffee. Elijah found Cora in the library corner. She was standing in front of the empty shelves with her arms crossed, looking at them with the same focused attention she had brought to the exterior inspection. He came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" he said. She considered the shelves for a moment. "They need books," she said. "They'll get them." She nodded, satisfied with this. Then she turned and looked up at him and asked the question he had been half expecting since that morning she'd asked if the debt was paid, and he hadn't yet had the answer she deserved. "Is it finished now?" she said. Not "is the debt paid" that was the question from before. This was a different question, more precise. The question of someone who had been thinking carefully about what finished actually meant and whether it was the same thing as resolved. Sylvia had come to stand near them. She was close enough to have heard. Elijah looked at his daughter. "Not entirely," he said. "Some things can't be finished completely. That's the truth of it." He held her gaze. "Your grandfather's treatment, the years. Those things don't have a corresponding restoration. Anyone who tells you different isn't telling you the truth." Cora listened without looking away. "But the record says what actually happened now," he said. "My name is on the right side of the story. That doesn't go away. And the people who made the wrong decisions have to live with what they decided. That's not nothing." Cora was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Sylvia. Not accusatory, just asking the way she always asked the real questions, because she wanted the real answer. "When you found out," she said, "what did you do?" Sylvia looked at this 8-year-old standing in front of the empty shelves with her arms crossed and her burgundy jacket buttoned all the way up and her face entirely serious. "I drove to your street," Sylvia said, "and I told your father the truth." Cora considered this, measured it against whatever standard she was applying. Then she uncrossed her arms, nodded once, the conclusive nod of someone who has received an answer that meets the standard. "Okay," she said. She looked at the empty shelves one more time. "I'm going to bring some of my books," she announced, "for when they open the library part." Then she walked past them both toward the door, apparently finished with this portion of the morning and ready for whatever came next. Elijah watched her go. He felt the thing he had been feeling since he stood up in the hotel room and spoke the solidity, the levelness of the ground beneath his feet. It was still there. He suspected it would remain. Not as triumph, not as the particular electricity of vindication he had once imagined, just as the quiet, steady sense of standing on terrain that actually reflected what was true, of being in a place where his name and his story were aligned. He looked at Sylvia. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying that hadn't already been said in the weeks and months that had brought them to this room, to this building, to this particular Saturday morning in February, with the cold coming through the south-facing windows, and Cora somewhere outside deciding whether the new tree was going to be all right. He found her in the plaza. She had her hand on the trunk of the young tree, standing very still, the way she stood when she was checking something rather than simply touching it. 3 wooden stakes in the frozen ground, guy wires running from the stakes to the tree at equal intervals, keeping it upright against the wind that came down the street. In the particular way Philadelphia wind came in February, not dramatic, just persistent, the kind of cold that was going to be there, whether you acknowledged it or not. Cora had her head tilted slightly. She was reading the tree the way her father read structures. Elijah stood at the edge of the plaza and watched her. He thought about the morning he found the cracks in the Caldwell Crossing columns, the specific quality of the light that October low and sideways, making the fracture lines deeper than they might have appeared in direct sun. He thought about the trailer, the certified mail counter, the tracking number, the folder with nothing inside it. He thought about 40 minutes in a lobby on Market Street, standing still while the world went about its business around him, learning the exact dimensions of the space where his name mattered versus the space where it didn't. He thought about Renata's hand in his in a hospital room in December cold outside Cora, asleep under a blanket with a cartoon giraffe on it. He thought about the hallway drawings that he had looked at every single morning for years and never taken down, not because he forgot they were there, but because they were exactly the kind of thing a man holds on to when the larger dignities have been stripped from him and the small ones are what remains. He thought about what it meant that the third drawer of the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom now held a letter from the state licensing board with his name on the tab in his own handwriting, next to a one-page acknowledgement that said what had happened to him in language that would not be altered or amended or revised by anyone, because it was in the permanent record now, and the permanent record did not bend. Cora turned and looked at him. She had finished her assessment. "It's going to be fine," she said. She said it with the matter-of-fact certainty she used for things she had evaluated and concluded about. Not wishful, not hopeful. Certain the way she was certain about things she had checked for herself. He walked out into the cold toward her. The sky above Eastbrook was the same flat pale blue it had been all morning, wide and empty of clouds, the kind of sky that in February felt less like winter ending and more like winter being honest about itself, clear because there was nothing obscuring it, cold because that was what it actually was. He reached her. She moved to stand beside him, both of them looking at the tree for a moment, in the way they sometimes stood looking at things together without needing to explain what they were looking at or why. The tree moved slightly in the wind. The wooden stakes held. Things took time to take root. That was simply true. You planted them and staked them and waited and kept the ground around them clear, and eventually, if the conditions were right and the work had been done correctly, they held. They held and they grew, and in time they held themselves without the stakes and the guy wires because the root system had gone deep enough to make the support unnecessary. He put his hand on Cora's shoulder. She leaned against him slightly, the weight of a child who is comfortable enough with a person to simply be present in the way of a body that trusts another body. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The wind moved through the plaza and the tree moved with it, and the stakes held and the morning held and the record held, and the ground beneath his feet was level in the way it had not been level for 6 years. He had filed the report. He had done his job correctly and completely, and in writing and with evidence, and they had taken the evidence and put his name on the wrong story, and he had carried that for 6 years in this city, in this life, in this skin. And then he had done it again. He had done the right thing again at cost, with his eyes open, with his daughter watching, with the full understanding of what it was going to require and the full acceptance of what it was going to take. The record said so now. That didn't go away. He looked out across the plaza toward the street, toward the direction of Delwood Avenue, 2 miles east toward the house, with the third step that creaked, and the kitchen window that stuck in summer, and the hallway with the drawings taped in careful straight rows. Toward the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom. Toward the folder with his name on the tab in his own handwriting, and the letter inside that said what was true and would go on saying it. The tree moved in the wind. Cora's weight against his side was steady and warm. He stood there in the February cold and let the morning be what it was.